Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. You sent us Chapter 2 from a Psychology Research Methods textbook.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so we're going to really unpack how scientists think.
Yeah.
It's like they're detectives of the mind.
Yeah, I like that. Detectives of the mind. And it's interesting because we all think we're like pretty good at figuring things out in our everyday lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Intuition, past experience.
Totally.
But science, it's a totally different approach, much more rigorous.
Definitely, yeah. And it makes me think of that story of Clever Hans, the horse that everyone thought could do math.
Oh, right.
And like, people were amazed. He would tap his hoof to count. Everyone was like, oh my gosh, this horse is an equine genius.
Yeah. Clever Hans is like the perfect example of why scientists are so careful about jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
It turns out he wasn't actually doing math. He was just picking up on these really subtle cues from his handler, like a tiny nod, even just a change in posture.
Oh, sneaky. So it seemed like he was doing something incredible, but it was actually much simpler.
Yeah, way simpler.
And sneaky.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's why in science, this idea of control is so important. Scientists design experiments where they can isolate different factors and see what's really causing something.
Okay.
Like almost like if you're testing a new recipe, you're changing one ingredient at a time.
Yeah.
To see how it affects the final dish.
I get it. So it's not just like passively watching things happen.
Yeah.
You're actually manipulating something to see what changes.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the thing they change is called the independent variable. And then the outcome that they're measuring, that's the dependent variable.
Okay, so can you give me an example of that in a real study?
Sure. Let's say researchers are looking at how sleep affects memory, right?
Yeah.
So the independent variable would be how much sleep people get. Some people get 8 hours, some get 6, some only get 4.
Right. Okay.
And then the dependent variable would be their score on a memory test the next day.
Got it.
So by controlling how much sleep people get, they can start to see how it affects memory.
Okay, so it's almost like they're putting the world in this controlled environment, like a lab.
Yes.
So they can see what's really going on without all the noise and distractions of everyday life.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Now, another important part of the scientific method is defining exactly what you're studying.
Okay.
Scientists use the term constructs for these, like ideas or concepts like intelligence, anxiety, love.
Yeah, yeah. But like some of those things are really hard to define.
Exactly.
Let alone like measure.
Yeah.
How do scientists make sure everyone's on the same page?
That's where they use operational definitions, which is basically like exactly how are you going to measure that thing.
Got it.
So for intelligence, you might use an IQ test score as your operational definition. Or for anxiety, you might measure things like heart rate or how nervous someone says they feel.
Okay, so it's like you're creating a recipe for measuring something abstract.
Yeah.
It has to be specific enough so everyone can follow it and get consistent results. But I'm thinking, what if someone disagrees with how you've defined something? Like intelligence, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, the way you define things can definitely be debated.
Right.
And scientists are always looking for like more accurate and better ways to measure things. The important thing is by being really clear about their definitions, they can compare their findings with other people's findings and like build on each other's work even if they don't agree on every single detail.
That makes sense. So we've got control, careful definitions. What are scientists ultimately trying to do with all this?
So there are 4 main goals.
Okay.
Description, prediction, explanation, and application. Let's start with description.
Yeah.
Scientists want to accurately describe what's happening. Think of it like a giant data puzzle. Each study adds a piece, and eventually we start to see the bigger picture.
I like that. So it's not just about collecting random facts.
Right.
It's about putting those facts together to really understand something.
Right. And then there's prediction. When scientists find a correlation between 2 things, that means they tend to happen together.
Yeah.
And that lets them make predictions about what might happen in the future.
Like, if there's a correlation between exercise and good mood, we might predict that someone who exercises regularly will have better mental health than someone who doesn't.
Okay.
But it's important to remember, correlation doesn't necessarily mean that one thing causes the other.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting, right?
Right.
Because scientists don't just want to describe and predict.
Right.
They want to understand why things happen the way they do.
Exactly. And that brings us to explanation, which is all about cause and effect.
Okay.
So this is where experiments are really useful because they let scientists control for other factors and figure out what's really causing something.
Right. So in our exercise example, researchers could do an experiment where they randomly assign people to either exercise
Yeah.
or no exercise.
That's right. And then they could see how that affects their mood to make sure it's not something else that's different between the groups.
Yes. So they're creating like a mini controlled world to see how things play out.
I like that. But wait a minute. We always hear correlation doesn't equal causation.
Mm-hmm.
So how do scientists actually prove that one thing causes another?
You're totally right. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. To show causation, scientists need to be really careful.
Okay, what do they need to do?
Well, they need to show that the cause happens before the effect,
Right.
that the two things happen together consistently,
Okay.
and super important, that there's no other possible explanation for that relationship.
So going back to our exercise and mood example,
Yeah.
they need to show that the exercise happened before the mood improved.
Yes.
That people who exercise more consistently have better moods.
Right.
And that there's no other reason for it.
Right. Exactly.
Like maybe people who exercise also have better diets or more friends.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Got it. Like detectives gathering clues to solve a case.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay. So we've got description, prediction, explanation. What about application? Is that where science leaves the lab and gets out in the world?
Yes, application is about using what we know from science to solve real-world problems, to make people's lives better, or to create something new and interesting.
Right, like the practical side of science.
Exactly. For example, research on how people learn has led to better teaching methods,
Yeah.
or research on what causes stress has led to ways to help people manage stress and be healthier.
Okay. So it's like taking those scientific insights from the lab and actually using them to make things better.
That's exactly it. And it's not just about scientists coming up with solutions on their own. They actually work with the people who are affected by the problem. Like, if it's about stress, they would work with people who are stressed.
Right, to make sure the solutions actually work for them.
Right. And, sometimes the line between pure research and applied research gets a little blurry.
What do you mean by that?
Well, sometimes you make a discovery just out of curiosity, doing basic research, and then it turns out to have a really useful application.
Oh, wow.
Or the other way around. A problem in the real world might lead to a whole new research question.
That's so cool. So it's like this constant loop.
Exactly.
Basic research leading to applications, real-world problems, inspiring new research.
It's super dynamic.
Wow, that's really neat.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how scientists use the scientific method to describe things, predict things, explain things. We've talked about the role of theories, but how do they actually gather the evidence?
You're talking about research methods, right?
Yes.
It's like having a toolbox full of different tools for measuring and understanding human behavior.
Okay.
And each method, each tool, has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Choosing the right one is key to answering the specific research question you're interested in.
Okay, so I guess we're ready to open that toolbox.
Yeah. Let's get our hands dirty.
And get to work. Stay tuned, listeners, because in our next segment, we'll be diving into the world of surveys, experiments, observations, case studies, the tools of the trade for detectives of the mind.
All right, let's do it.
Sounds good.
It's kind of crazy how much science is woven into our lives
I know.
without us even realizing it.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It really is.
From the apps we use to how we parent our kids.
Yeah.
So much of what we do is influenced by scientific discoveries, even if we don't even realize it.
Absolutely. And psychology especially, understanding how people think and feel and behave. I mean, that can be applied to so many different things.
Okay, so let's talk about applied research. How do psychologists use their knowledge to make a real difference in the world? What are some examples?
Well, one area where it's had a huge impact is mental health.
Okay.
Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Yeah, CBT.
That's rooted in decades of research on how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all work together.
Yeah, it's so interesting how research has led to these practical tools to help people live better lives.
Totally.
CBT is all about helping people identify and change those negative thought patterns.
Right.
That can contribute to anxiety or depression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just individual therapy either.
Okay.
Applied psychology also works on a larger scale to address social problems, create positive change in communities.
Okay, can you give me an example of what that looks like?
Sure. Think about bullying in schools.
Okay.
Researchers have spent years studying it. the dynamics,
Yeah.
what contributes to it, the best ways to prevent it.
Yeah.
And that research has actually led to the development of anti-bullying program
Oh, wow.
that schools can use to make things safer and more positive for everyone.
So it's like taking those scientific insights and turning them into real-world solutions.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just about coming up with solutions in some lab. It's about working with the people who are actually affected by the problem.
Right.
Like in this case, students, teachers, parents, community members.
Yeah, to make sure it actually works for them.
Exactly, to create solutions that are tailored to their specific needs. And sometimes the most interesting solutions come from blurring the lines a little bit
Okay.
between basic and applied research.
What do you mean?
Well, for a long time, people thought basic research was just about knowledge for its own sake.
Yeah, like pure knowledge.
Right, and applied research was all about finding solutions.
Right, okay.
But now we're seeing more and more how these two can feed into each other.
So it's like a discovery in a lab, just from curiosity, could end up having a real-world application.
Totally.
Wow, that's cool.
And the other way around, real-world problems can lead to new research questions.
So this is like dynamic interplay between the two.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we've talked about how scientists use the scientific method to describe things, predict things, explain things. We've talked about theories.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what are the actual tools that psychologists use to gather evidence?
You're talking about research methods.
Yeah.
It's like we've been looking at a blueprint for a house. Now we're ready to actually pick up the tools and start building.
Okay.
So let's dive into the world of research methods. And we can start with one that's probably pretty familiar to most people.
Surveys.
Surveys.
Yeah.
Those questionnaires that ask about everything.
Yes. Everything from your favorite ice cream to your political views.
Yeah.
Surveys are great for gathering information from a lot of people quickly.
Right.
They can measure attitudes, police, behaviors, so many things.
Right, like all those political polls you see around election time.
Exactly.
They rely on survey data.
They do. Even those personality quizzes that tell you what animal you are.
Oh, yeah, those are fun.
Yeah.
Those are surveys, too. They are.
Yeah. But surveys can actually give us really valuable insights into patterns and trends.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when researchers are really careful about who they're asking and how they're asking the questions.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you want your findings to apply to a larger group of people, your sample, the people you survey, needs to be a good representation of that whole group.
Okay.
If it's biased,
right.
your results might not be accurate.
So like if you only surveyed people in one city, you can't assume your results would apply to the whole country.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's how the questions are worded.
Right.
Leading questions or poorly worded questions, those can really influence how people respond.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So even with a survey, there's a lot of nuance, careful planning involved
Totally.
to make sure the results are actually meaningful.
Definitely. And while surveys are great for getting that big picture overview,
Yeah.
they're not always the best for understanding cause and effect. For that, we often turn to experiments.
Experiments. Okay, back to those. We touched on them before, but I'm ready to go deeper.
Okay.
Remind me, why are experiments like the gold standard for proving that one thing causes another?
It's because in an experiment,
Yeah.
the researcher can actually manipulate a variable, the independent variable, and see how it affects another variable, the dependent variable, while keeping everything else the same.
So going back to sleep and memory, researchers could actually control how much sleep people get.
Yes.
And see how that affects their memory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the key here is random assignment, putting people in different groups randomly.
Okay.
That helps make sure that any differences you see between the groups are because of the thing you changed, not some other pre-existing difference between the people.
So it's like you're creating two groups that are the same in every way.
Right.
Except for that one thing you're manipulating.
Exactly.
Like the amount of sleep.
Yeah. And by doing that, by controlling everything else, experiments let researchers isolate the real effect of that independent variable.
I get it. But are there ever times when experiments aren't possible or maybe they're not ethical?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can't just manipulate everything you want to study in a lab.
Right, right.
Sometimes the best way to study something is to just observe it happening naturally without trying to control anything.
Okay.
That's where observational research comes in.
Okay. Like, I'm imagining Jane Goodall observing chimps in the wild.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Observational research can give you really rich insights into complex behaviors, social interactions.
Yeah, in the real world.
In the real world, exactly. But there's a risk there. right?
What's that?
The observer's own biases might affect what they see.
Right, yeah.
So to try to avoid that, observational researchers will often have multiple people observing,
Okay.
and they come up with really clear guidelines for what counts as a specific behavior.
Right.
So everybody's looking for the same thing and recording it in the same way.
Like a set of rules for observing.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that keeps it objective.
Right. And by comparing what multiple observers see,
Uh-huh.
researchers can check for consistency and see if there are any biases creeping in.
Okay, so we've got surveys, experiments, observations. What about when researchers want to study something really rare or unique, and they want to study it in depth?
That's when they use case studies.
Okay.
A case study is an in-depth investigation of a single person or a group or maybe even a specific event.
Like Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who had that metal rod go through his skull.
Yes, exactly. His case was so important
Oh, wow.
in our early understanding of how different parts of the brain work.
Wow.
Case studies are really good for studying those rare things
Yeah,
or
yeah.
exploring the complexities of human experience in a way you just couldn't do with bigger studies.
So it's like a deep dive
Yeah.
into one specific instance
Totally.
to really try to understand a particular phenomenon.
Exactly. And while you can't generalize from a case study to everyone, like
Yeah.
you can with a survey or an experiment,
Yeah.
they can give you valuable insights
Yeah.
that might lead to new hypotheses for future research,
Okay.
or maybe even challenge existing theories.
That's really neat. Wow, we've covered a lot of different methods. It's amazing how many tools researchers have to study the mind and behavior.
It really is.
And I guess each approach has its strengths and weaknesses, right?
Absolutely.
It depends what you're trying to study.
Yeah, it's about using the right tool for the job.
Right, exactly.
That's what makes research methods so cool. It's such a dynamic field.
Yeah.
People are always coming up with new techniques,
Mhm.
trying to get a better grasp on the complexities of how we behave.
It's like there's always something new to learn.
Oh,
New
wow.
ways to see the world.
Yeah, for sure.
This has been great.
Yeah.
We've gone from the big picture of the scientific method to these really specific research methods.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
But before we wrap up, there's one more important piece.
What's that?
How do scientists actually analyze all this data they collect?
Ah, you're talking about statistics.
Yes, the world of statistics. Get ready, listeners, because in our next segment, we'll be tackling this sometimes scary but ultimately fascinating world
Okay.
of statistical analysis.
All right.
We'll see how scientists use stats to make sense of their data, test their hypotheses, and hopefully uncover the truth about how we behave.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the scientific method. We've journeyed through the foundational principles, explored those different research methods, and now it's time for, well, the part that often makes people a bit nervous.
Yeah, statistics. I
Statistics.
get it. It can seem intimidating, like almost a secret language
Yeah.
that only, certain people understand.
Right.
But it's really just a way to make sense of data, like seeing patterns and drawing conclusions you wouldn't see just by looking at the raw numbers.
Okay. So instead of being afraid of statistics, we should think of it as like a superpower.
Exactly. A superpower that helps us unlock the secrets hidden in the data.
I like that. And is it a superpower anyone can learn?
Definitely. It's about understanding those basic concepts and how they're used in research.
Okay. I'm ready to embrace my inner statistician. Where do we begin?
Well, one of the first things scientists do after they collect all this data is to just describe it, get a sense of what it looks like overall.
Yeah.
They might calculate things like the average or the range or how much the data varies.
So it's like taking a snapshot of the data, getting a feel for the big picture before diving into the detail.
Exactly. Those are called descriptive statistics.
Okay.
They give you a nice summary, help researchers see if there are any patterns or trends.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about testing hypotheses and actually drawing conclusions? That's where things get a bit trickier, right?
You're right. To go beyond just describing the data, researchers use what we call inferential statistics,
Okay.
which let them make guesses or inferences about a larger group of people
Right.
based on just a sample.
So like using the results from a survey of a few hundred people
Yeah,
to make conclusions about, say, the whole country.
exactly. Inferential statistics involves testing hypotheses
Right?
and calculating how likely it is that the results you see are due to chance or to a real effect.
Got it. Can you give me an example of how that works?
Sure. Let's say researchers are testing a new drug to see if it reduces anxiety.
So
They might give the drug to one group of people and a placebo to another group,
Uh-huh.
and then measure everyone's anxiety levels. Inferential statistics would help them figure out if the difference in anxiety between the two groups is what we call statistically significant.
So that means it's unlikely to be just a coincidence.
Right, not just random chance.
Yeah.
And that's where this idea of a p-value comes in. It's like a measure of the probability of getting those results if there was no real effect.
Got it. So a low p-value means it's unlikely the results were just a fluke.
Exactly. In most research, a p-value of less than 0.05
Okay.
is considered statistically significant.
Okay. So if they find a significant difference, p-value less than 0.05, they can be more confident that the drug is actually doing something.
Yes, exactly. It supports their hypothesis.
Okay.
But of course, that p-value is just one part of the story.
Right.
Researchers also look at how big the effect is.
Right, like how much of a difference the drug makes.
Right. And things like the study's design, the people who participated.
So it's not just about crunching numbers blindly.
Not at all.
It's about understanding what those numbers actually mean in the context of the whole study.
Exactly. Statistics are a powerful tool, but you have to use them thoughtfully and ethically.
Right. It's not about finding the result you want. It's about uncovering the truth.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, we've talked about descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, p-values. It's a lot to take in, but I'm starting to see how these tools help us make sense of the data.
It is a lot, but you're doing great.
Thanks.
It's like learning a new language, but once you get the basics, it opens up this whole world of understanding.
And it's a language we need to understand if we want to be smart consumers of research, right?
Definitely. By understanding the basics of statistics, you can look at research findings more critically.
Right.
See when someone might be making misleading claims.
Right.
Make better decisions in your own life.
This has been fantastic. We've really gone on a journey here to the scientific method.
We really have.
From the big picture ideas down to those specific research methods and even tackling statistics.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing we've learned is that this isn't just for scientists.
It really isn't.
It's a way of thinking that everyone can use. Approaching the world with curiosity, a healthy bit of skepticism, and a commitment to looking at the evidence.
I completely agree. By doing that, by thinking that way, we can all be more informed citizens, more careful about the information we believe, and better problem solvers in our own lives.
So the next time you see a headline or hear someone make a claim, think back to what we've talked about today. Ask yourself, what's the evidence? How did they collect it? How did they analyze it? And what conclusions can we really draw from it?
There are so many interesting questions out there waiting to be explored, and the scientific method, with all its little quirks, gives us the tools and the way of thinking to do just that.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions, stay curious, and keep that scientific spirit alive.